Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jenna Ashton, and I'm an artist and a lecturer in heritage studies at the University of Manchester in the Institute for Cultural Practices. And this talk today is part of the Scottish Civic Trust lecture series on heritage, equity and climate crisis. And my talk is titled Ecologies and Communities, Heritage as a Social and Multi-Species Practice. So I'm going to share my slides. All of my slides are visual, so there aren't any little bits of writing that you've got to pay attention to. They're all visual images. So I'll make a start. So concepts of ecology and community increasingly come to the fore in discourse fueled by environmental concerns, as well as analysis around social cohesion and diversity. Ecology in the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. Community potentially concerns people living in a particular area or people who are considered as a unit because of their common interests, social group or nationality. But what does it mean to make or perform community today? How do communities come together? What is the role of identity and power within community structures? How do issues and realities such as migration and diaspora or homelessness and spatial redevelopment impact a concept of community? So both ecology and community concern the interconnectedness of things and the complexity of layered relationships and interactions within and between human and more than human existence. Notably, ecology and community are tied up with practices and processes that are spatially situated. Multi-species ethnography and scholarship emphasises the plurality of communities and organisms and offers ecological models for building and evolving new communities in times of stress, fear, grief and loss. So this talk will consider how multi-species approaches offers opportunities for an expanded field of heritage studies and heritage practice as we begin to consider the role of ecology and community for addressing the climate emergency, inequalities and global movement. So hopefully for about 40 minutes or so, I'll try and keep on track with time. I'll offer reflections and learning from my current major project concerning community climate resilience, situated in a residential area of post-industrial Manchester. And this is an image I'm showing you here from that particular area. So this is an area called Miles Platting, and the whole ward that we're working in is actually called Miles Platting and Newton Heath. And as I'm sure all of you are very aware, even though you have these kind of political wards, there is so much difference and a variation within a single boundary. So this is a very specific snapshot of this particular area. And I chose this image just simply because of the varied skyline that we have here that kind of gives you a sense of the transformation and evolving nature spatially and architecturally of this particular location. So before that I move into this particular example, I think it's useful to outline how I approach the study of heritage as a field of scholarship, pedagogy and practice, namely through the discipline of heritage studies for which I lecture. So heritage studies is still very much an evolving disciplinary area with varied methodologies bringing together perspectives and approaches from cultural studies, archaeology, geography, sociology, history, and the arts. And heritage studies today demands that we think critically about heritage as a concept and performance and its materialization and how it pertains to identities, power, and ethics. So very much in the vein of a broader cultural studies, then heritage studies concentrates upon the political dynamics of contemporary and historical heritage making and practices. So the shaping of decisions about what we express, how we express care for things, and how values get attributed to spaces and things and people and processes. So co-production and a values-led practice are espoused by the more recent turn described as critical heritage studies, and I'm quoting from people like Laura Jane Smith and Rodney Harrison, etc. So critical heritage studies emerges officially as a disciplinary approach in the early 2000s. So inspired by an earlier anti-colonial, Black and Indigenous and feminist thinking practice. The Association of Critical Heritage Studies, or ACHS, held its initial conference at the University of Gothenburg in 2012. The manifesto of the association claims the discipline should challenge, and I quote, nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, cultural elitism, Western triumphalism, social exclusion based on class and ethnicity, and the fetishizing of expert knowledge, close quote. Specifically, as stated in the manifesto, again, open quote, we argue that a truly critical heritage studies will ask many uncomfortable questions of traditional ways of thinking about and doing heritage, and that the interests of the marginalised and excluded will be brought to the forefront when posing those questions, close quote. The association approach, therefore, demands a programme of research and practice engaging with diverse content and authorship and methodologies. It also encourages learning programmes driven by social and environmental justice concerns. So heritage as a social practice then tries to understand the social situatedness and complexity of perspectives, meanings and values attributed within our environments. Heritage as a social practice is generated, renewed and reproduced by people through space and time. The material world and its creative acts then are both the remnants and the drivers of a continuous and fairly contentious cycle of narrative and storytelling, which is continuously shifting, informed by desires and demands, visibility and invisibility, eradication or permanence, aesthetics and taste, oppression and subjugation. Although some people would like heritage to be a fixed selection and prescribed set of standards confirming certain ideals of national identity, in practice, it is always in flux, being shaped externally and internally. And to me, this is what makes heritage studies an exciting developing field. Of course, when it comes to national and international policies, such as UNESCO's World Heritage List, for example, heritage does indeed become a more prescribed and locked set of ideals, although this is now shifting. Certainly in my own teaching and research, I find the essentializing division of natural and cultural heritage hugely problematic. And it's especially not helpful in the evolving discourse around conservation and climate change. Of course, thousands of scholars before me, especially Indigenous practitioners and researchers, have challenged this division of nature and culture for some time, as if somehow the human species is not part of nature. So taking us back then to 2012, we have the first edition of the Open Access Journal for Environmental Humanities, which when you read its editorial and advisory board is the who's who in humanities-led environmental and ecological scholarship. So the edition is edited by people like Deborah Bird-Rose, Thomas van der Ren and Anna Singh. So notably, in the first editorial, they credit the lengthy work undertaken in this area by feminists and ecological philosophers, especially that of Australian philosopher Val Plumwood, who identified, and I quote, 2 central tasks for the ecological humanities. These tasks are to resituate the human within the environment and to resituate non-humans within cultural and ethical domains. Both tasks aim to overcome the nature-cultural binary that positions humans outside of nature and thus implicitly posits that we are free to control our own destiny within a broader natural world that is devoid of meaning, values and ethics. Plumwood was part of a larger tradition of environmental philosophy that over the past few decades has addressed issues as diverse as the moral state of non-humans, modes of ethical thought such as biocentrism, ecocentrism, ecofeminism, the mindfulness of matter, and numerous other areas of analysis, close quote. I think this is where the specifics of a multi-species ethnographic approach and framing contributes a potentially important shift for heritage studies, which is still yet more radical and predates the so-called critical heritage studies movement. Sorry, I'm just going to move my next slide. There we go. So I'm going to come on to this in a minute. This is a particular issue then by the Environmental Humanities journal that I've just mentioned. This issue is from 2016. Before I dive into that though, I just wanted to flag another quite brilliant literature review of multi-species ethnography scholarship across animals, plants, people and things, which was undertaken in 2013 by Professor Laura Ogden for the Journal of Environment and Society. And although it's getting on for about 9 years old now, I still think it does a pretty cracking job of synthesizing key ideas within the work and identifying different human actors that shape discourse, and especially themes that continue to evolve, such as assemblage, rhizomes, interspecies mutuality, interconnectedness, contact zones, ideas of becoming, anti-essentialist ethics, anti-human exceptionalism, non-human agency, political ecology, and complicating concepts of species, particularly language around native, invasive, and exotic, and how all of this interacts within wider cultural concerns of oppression and equality. So as I say, that's an earlier literature review by Professor Laura Ogden, so do look that up because I think that's a really useful review. But anyway, moving on then to this example. So this is the 2016 volume 8 issue 1 of Environmental Humanities, entitled Multi-Species Studies. And again, it's edited by Deborah Bird-Rose, Thomas van der Ren, Anna Singh and others. I'm going to read the abstract in full as it offers a very clear picture of where we're up to with this thinking of multi-species studies and multi-species ethnography and approaches. So, open quote. Scholars in the humanities and social sciences are experimenting with novel ways of engaging with worlds around us. Passionate immersion in the lives of fungi, microorganisms, animals and plants is opening up new understandings, relationships and accountabilities. This introduction to the special issue here offers an overview of the emerging field of multi-species studies, unsettling notions of species. It explores a broad terrain of possible modes of classifying, categorizing and paying attention to the diverse ways of life that constitute worlds. From detailed attention to particular entities, a multiplicity of possible connections and understanding opens up. Species always multiple, multiplying their forms and associations. It is this coming together of questions of kinds and their multiplicities that characterizes multi-species studies. A range of approaches to knowing and understanding each other, modes of immersion, ground and guide this research. Engagements and collaborations with scientists, farmers, hunters, indigenous peoples, activists and artists are catalyzing new forms of ethnographic and ethological inquiry. This article explores the broader theoretical context of multi-species studies, asking what is at stake epistemologically, politically and ethically in learning to be attentive to diverse ways of life. Are all lively entities biological, or might a tornado, a stone or a volcano be amenable to similar forms of immersion? What does it mean to live with others in entangled worlds of contingency and uncertainty? More fundamentally, how can we do the work of inhabiting and co-constituting worlds well? In taking up these questions, this article explores the cultivation of arts of attentiveness, modes of both paying attention to others and crafting meaningful responses. Close quote. So that's the opening. So that's the abstract from the opening introduction article within this particular edition. So there are some really important things that come out then of this edition in 2016 that I would say are added aspects to Laura Ogden's initial literature review in 2013. So the first is that idea of passionate immersion. The other is around this idea of arts of attentiveness, so modes of both paying attention to others and crafting meaningful response. That's a really fascinating idea of thinking about the world. The other issue that they raise quite emphatically is around multiplicity and diversity. new forms of ethnographics. They're encouraging new forms of ethnographic and ethnological inquiry. And in a different article by, oh, sorry, let me go back. In a different article by Van der Ren and Deborah Bird-Rose in 2012, they talk about multiple storied places. But I think they settle on this really important final question, which is asking what is at stake. So how does it shift our perception? How does it shift the way we think about the world and the way we think about communities in particular? It's what I'm interested in. You know, what is at stake when we shift our perspective to a kind of multi-species framing? And of course, some of this can actually seem quite abstract, if not connected to specific examples and case studies. But you can find wonderful work in this journal and elsewhere. So I just wanted to flag two particular books, actually. So Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in a capitalist ruins. This book is frequently quoted as a really wonderful example of multi-species practice that's really working in all the complexity, the international and localized complexity of exploring the relationships connected to this particular mushroom and understanding how it works economically, you know, within economic systems and so on. It's quite a chunky book, but it's a really fascinating example. But also, I really love this this recent book as well, 2020 publication, Whale Snow by Chi Sakak Ibara. I'm trying to get that name right, Sakak Ibara, which is, I think, a really great exemplar for people entering into multi-species studies and multi-species ethnography for the first time, and connecting it to broader heritage practices. And again, for me, this is where this kind of thinking about the connections between the sort of multi-species approach and the wider critical heritage studies discipline. I think this book does a really good job, actually, of demonstrating how these two things are interacting and enmeshed, actually. So I'm just going to quote again the blurb from the book, so it gives you a good sense of what this book's about. So open quote. As a mythical creature, the whale has been responsible for many transformations in the world. It is an enchanting being that humans have long felt a connection to. In the contemporary environmental imagination, whales are charismatic megafauna feeding our environmentalism and aspirations for a better and more sustainable future. Using multi-species ethnography, Whale Snow explores how everyday relatedness of the Inupiat of Arctic Alaska, so that's an indigenous community in Alaska, and the bowhead whale forms and transforms the human through their encounters with modernity. Whale Snow shows how people live in the world that intersects with other beings, how these connections came into being, and most importantly, how such intimate and intense relations help humans survive the social challenges incurred by climate change. In this time of ecological transition, exploring multi-species relatedness is crucial as it keeps social capacities to adapt relational, elastic, and resilient. In the Arctic, climate, culture, and human resilience are connected through bow-headed whaling. In Whale Snow, we see how climate change disrupts this ancient practice and, in the process, affects a vital expression of Indigenous sovereignty. Ultimately, though, this book offers a story of hope grounded in multi-species resilience, close quote. So yeah, I really do encourage you to get hold of a copy of this book. So for me, this is a beautiful example of telling a story about living heritage that is bound up with an intense and complex relationship between species, and where another species is making the human and participating in co-creating culture. As a multi-species ethnography, this book is concerned with making sense of different forms of life caught up in diverse relationships of knowing and living together. That last bit is a quote from Van der Ren and co. from 2016. So that idea of, yeah, diversity, knowing and living together and exploring that. So that springboards me nicely into my own evolving multi-species inquiries, which I'm going to totally admit to are actually I still feel are in their early stages, and I'm still learning through this process of decentering the human, or thinking about what those relationships are between the human and more than human. So although as a feminist, as a feminist, the ecological and environmental has always been in my frame, I'm very much on a journey of developing my practice and approach from multi-species ethnography and making sense of what it offers and how it potentially shapes my understanding of community, of place, of knowledge, and of situated experiences. So the first example I'm going to share caught me off guard somewhat when I was engaging. So recently I've written a piece which is kind of under review at the moment, was under editorial at the moment, called "Following the Dogs of Pristina: Landscape as Living Memorial." So hopefully this journal article will be out in the coming months. And this really is a piece around auto-ethnographic storytelling and analysis, and considering what multi-species framing can offer post-war memorialization discourse and practice. So during 2019 then, I undertook initial scoping and consultation around the potential of a new museum or memorial site for post-war Kosovo. The aim for this new site is to encourage reflection, peace building, and action around human rights. And in Kosovo, there are multiple and conflicting memorialization practices enacted by war veterans, politicians, mourning widows and mothers, activists and survivors. And these all take different forms, from statues to protests, oral histories and curatorial interventions. The physical landscape of Kosovo, as in all wars, is the site of crime and resistance, mythologizing and denial. But amongst the human memorial activity live the stray dogs of Pristina. The dogs activated my attentiveness to the potential of a living landscape as a site of multi-species inquiry for rethinking processes of memorialization and heritage making. So for me, this is a kind of first time really where these two things of multi-species understanding or exploration come together within the wider kind of heritage practice and heritage studies in my work. So the dogs are free roaming, yet they rely on collective human care to survive. And admittedly, they had not been included in my planned approach for analysing the memorial practices of Kosovo. As the complexity of the consultation I was undertaking became more evident, the movements of the dogs in the city shifted from the periphery of my vision to being of equal concern to my encounters with people. Dogs are also part of the story of struggle, of expression and construction, of identity. Their histories with and around people also matter. And there is a vast body of scholarship of animals in war and also subjects of memorialization, but little on the post-war afterlives of animals, and particularly not in Kosovo, aside from just journalistic reporting. As the dogs came into my view, so did the significance of the landscape outside of museum walls. The landscape as a site of movement, displacement, atrocity and resistance was echoed in what I was encountering, but not yet understanding in terms of the free roaming dogs in the city. So I began following the dogs, taking field notes and images, exploring and analysing the patterns of care and coexistence. I realised I was witnessing an animal-human entanglement as part of post-war healing. This demanded, to quote Anna Singh, the arts of attentiveness, to better understand the species of this multi-species example of different forms of life caught up in diverse relationships of knowing and living together, quote Van der En. In the context of my post-war Kosovo consultation, focusing on entangled species resonated with the need to, as Donna Haraway suggests, staying with the trouble and navigate complexity. In my wider work, I'm already deeply committed to storytelling as an art of witnessing that engages with the multitudes of others in their noisy, fleshy living and dying, to quote Rose and Van der En. However, I hadn't anticipated the presence of more than human agents, the stray dogs, to be so affecting as to open up and disrupt my assumptions and readings of the city of Pristina. This disruption offers an alternative perspective for memorialization processes and analysis that to date have been stuck in an anthropocentric museological frame. So throughout this piece, then, I offer examples of my encounters with the stray dogs, in particular contact zones and so on, and what I glean from these encounters. And the conclusions that I draw from this work is that living alongside stray dogs, there are implications of sharing and caring for post-war healing and a transitional society that is remaking its democracy and its lines of ethical and moral behaviours. Kosovo human citizens should remember and care with humans the way in which they are already caring and remembering with the stray dog citizens of Pristina. As Donna Haraway quotes, caring means becoming subject to the unsettling obligation of curiosity, which requires knowing more at the end of the day than perhaps the beginning. The landscape and attentiveness within it can be, and perhaps already is in Kosovo, the memorial for the disenfranchised, the struggling, connecting, sharing, repairing, remembering and witnessing. Landscapes hold a multiplicity of stories and knowledges outside of museum walls. It counters the static singular vision of monuments. And if the aim of a post-war memorialisation in Kosovo is to rethink futures of equity and equality, then its human citizens need to learn from the lessons of living within an already entangled and diverse multi-species society. So this then moves into my second and final example, which is drawn directly from the work that I'm doing right now. So this is around my recent project on community climate resilience, living with uncertainty. And this project is part of the UK wider climate resilience programme funded by the UK Research Councils. The project is multidisciplinary across social practice, socially engaged art, heritage, music and performance, geography and climate science. And we were exploring very specific questions around barriers and solutions within participation, and particularly how arts and heritage practices and storytelling empower people within climate justice, action and policy work. So at the heart of this project, I'm trying to understand what residential community actually is in diverse and spatially and culturally complex post-industrial city areas, how community functions, how community perceives itself, who even makes up community in people's everyday experiences and imaginations. So some of these are the questions really that we're trying to dig into even before we start to really get to the nub of questions around climate crisis and climate action. A huge part of this work is being emotionally and physically present within neighbourhoods and with people. Now, I don't drive, which sometimes frustrates me a lot, but what it does force me to do is to physically work my way around and through spaces and places, either through public transport, but mostly through walking, particularly in Manchester. And especially during COVID-19, when walking outside became such important relief for people. If you were lucky enough to have good enough health to do it, walking is an experience to be fully within your body and with your senses. So during the COVID-19 lockdown, which is when our project officially commenced, walking became the way in which I could begin to understand the geographical area that I was working in, but to try and find ways to evolve encounters or exchanges that were very difficult and that were undertaken within very difficult and precarious health conditions. And in a similar fashion to the unexpected stray dogs in Pristina, to my surprise, the most prominent and president of residential beings across the board is the Canada goose, as pictured here. And not one, but pretty large families within this part of Manchester. They make their nests along the Rochdale Canal, which is, most usual, but they also regularly saunter across swathes of yet to be developed land, waddle up the side streets in twos and fours, and casually pass by the everyday corner newsagents. They are bold and a bit noisy, but pretty passive and not bothersome. The body of the Canada goose is the size of a medium dog, and its neck can stretch to a good 5 foot. So it's perhaps understandable that these beautiful but imposing birds can both, create awe, but also nervousness amongst people. And then there's the bad press, of course. So quite literally then, a Daily Mail article entitled "The Most Loathsome Bird in Britain," Robert Hardman, who is the author, says Canada geese deserve ASBOs, written in 2008. His article would have you think that the Canada goose was a knife-carrying street hoodlum, and no joke, this is his description, open quote. "Should there ever be a prize for Britain's most hated bird, then surely it would go to the Canada goose. If Canada geese were human, they would be lounging around all day doing nothing, claiming every welfare benefit in the book, driving their neighbours out of town and notching up ASBOs around the clock. While numbers have quadrupled in the last 40 years, local authorities and landowners hampered by the law," so this is the Wildlife Protection Act of 1981, "have fought a losing battle to keep their numbers at bay. The cuckoo may turf out other birds of their nests, but at least it has an interesting call. The feral pigeon may splatter our national landmarks, but it's a pretty flighty specimen which scarpers on demand. The Canada goose, however, just sits there like a corpulent squatter, fouling up its neighbourhood and munching its way through anything it feels like." He goes on. "All bird mess has its hazards, of course, but then the Canada goose is in a league of its own. This is partly because, with few natural predators, it strays further from the water than any other waterfowl, and it is because of its, and it is also because it colonises areas close to humans. Canada geese can't be doing with remote bird sanctuaries or far-flung marshland. That's too much like hard work. They like farmland, municipal parks, playing fields, riverbanks, gravel pits, and golf courses, all of which offer a rich diet of grass and leftovers with minimum effort." Close quote. So there's some really interesting language that's going on in this article. This idea that the goose is colonizing human spaces, and that really we should be able to decide where it goes and how it behaves. And it's frustrating for this particular journalist that the law, doesn't allow human species to be able to control the numbers in quite the way that he would like. But it's not just journalists such as Hardman that actually give the Canada goose a hard time in writing. It has to be said, the RSPB doesn't really do much to help their case either. On the website, offering the most basic of information with just a drawn illustration. I'm going to quote it here. They say, "The Canada goose is a large goose with a distinctive black head and neck and large white throat patch. An introduced species from North America, it has successfully spread to cover most of the UK. It forms noisy flocks and is often regarded as a nuisance in areas where large numbers occur on amenity grasslands and parks." And that is literally the only information that the RSPB gives on the Canada goose, which I think is pretty appalling, actually. But again, think about the language. So it talks about it being an introduced species, a nuisance, and emphasising how it is taking over human amenity grasslands and parks. The Wildlife Trust is a little better, and they have a wonderful regal image by Terry Whitaker of geese on the Thames, on the frozen Thames, or a frozen river. And it states, "The Canada goose is our largest goose and may be our most familiar. They are a common bird across most of the country, nesting on park lakes, flooded gravel pits and reservoirs. Canada geese are not native to this country, having been introduced from North America about 300 years ago. After the Second World War, they spread across the UK, becoming pests in some areas because they congregate in large numbers and can cause damage." So again, another similar type of language being used about being introduced, being pests, congregating, and so on. However, they do make a point that actually this goose is our most familiar, which is an important point I'll pick up on later on. The Scottish Wildlife Trust offers a softer and more thoughtful image by photographer Neil Aldridge, and gives us a sense of personality and behaviours, aesthetics and sonic presence. So actually the description offered by the Scottish the Scottish Wildlife Trust is actually quite interesting. So I'm just going to quote this. So the Canada goose is a large goose with a distinctive black head and neck and a large white throat patch. The breast and flanks are pale brown and there is a distinctive white patch under the tail. They form large flocks that roost together in autumn and winter on mud banks. Their loud honking announces their presence. They walk or fly in a noisy manner to their roosts at dusk. Canada geese are by nature migratory, but those living in the UK and Ireland tend to be resident birds. In Scotland, they are mostly sedentary, undertaking local movements to molting areas. Canada geese are sociable and noisy birds that live near freshwater areas such as lakes and ponds, as well as flooded sand and gravel pits, marshes, meadows, reservoirs, and sometimes estuaries. Their preferred habitat is near water with open areas of short grass. Although they are waterfowl, they spend as much time on land as they do in the water. In the spring and summer months, the geese eat leaves, flowers, stems, roots, seeds, berries, and grass. They have also been known to eat and damage crops. Less than 24 hours after they are born, goslings will be led to water by their parents to learn how to swim. Goslings will be able to dive up to 10 meters by the time they are 1 day old. Canada geese mate for life. They begin searching for a mate when they are between 2 and 3 years of age. So within this writing, I sense an affection and that time has been taken to be attentive to the social life of the Canada goose, its eating behaviours, its mating behaviours, and actually we get a whole lot more detail about the actual appearance of the goose and the sound of the goose, as well as this kind of social aspect to it. However, the RSPCA is the only organisation asking readers to actually think about living with Canada geese, and that's the title of a 3-page PDF of facts and history and behaviours, including guidance on how to feed the geese responsibly and how to report an injured bird. Importantly, the 3-pager opens with this statement: Canada geese were imported by wealthy individuals as ornaments in the 17th century. They are now well established in the wild with an estimated UK population of 190,000, close quote. So it seems the RSPCA are clearly positioning themselves here somewhat in opposition to the non-native species language used by the official ecological organisations I previously mentioned. And of course, the RSPCA has a contemporary role in supporting human and more than human species to coexist responsibly together. So their guidance here is trying to walk that tightrope of supporting people and geese equally. And as I say, they actually contextualise the fact that the Canada goose was first of all brought here, under colonial practices by the elite, and we're talking 300 years ago here. Likewise, it also seems that most scholars are interested in the Canada goose poo rather than their living and community habits. And maybe there's other literature out there, but I need to find it. There's a real lack of interest in the kind of social livelihoods of Canada goose. So it begs the question as to why, 300 years after its introduction to the UK, is the Canada goose still being labelled as a non-native species? Exactly how many years in the world do we have to be for a species to be counted as relevant, local, worthy of attention and care? What I find disturbing and fascinating about the Canada goose as a potential multi-species study is this reputation that has been culturally constructed around its presence, with somewhat raging racial and anti-migrant overtones, not only from the right-wing press, but from official ecological organisations through their language, which encourages a kind of speciesism. And of course, the Daily Mail is also trying to assimilate this particular example of local, mostly now urban wildlife to its human counterparts, suggesting that Canada geese are an embodiment of so-called benefit scrounging layabouts, which are in reality generations of working class urban residents who have been existing in an environment of redevelopment and gentrification that has well and truly negated and neglected their existence, much like the Canada goose. Both the geese and the local residents leave too much shit on display, shit pointing to neglect or lack of care, which rubs up against the shiny urbanite image Manchester's politicos project outwards to the rest of the world. So during my year of walking and sitting and watching and listening, I think I came to be in the company of the geese more than people. I began to make connections with residents in discussing climate and ecological issues. I sometimes ventured to ask people's thoughts about the geese. These are some of the responses. Oh, they're vicious. My dogs sometimes scare them. I don't know really, they're just always about. They're on the 2 canals, sometimes on the Irk River. Oh, they just shit everywhere. They're quite funny, I guess. We don't notice them really, they've just always been here. There was one particular incident that inflamed the online social community in particular. Apparently 1 or 2 geese had been abducted or killed by either local travellers, migrant communities, or homeless folks. No one really knew, but there was lots of speculation. Of course, the bile spilled into anti-racist and anti-migrant sentiment. And I was in 2 minds about the killing of the geese. I'm a vegetarian and dislike industrial farming. So to me, the taking of 2 local geese to kill to eat for food seemed more humane than purchasing a cheap cut of pork or beef or chicken in the local supermarket. Of course, legally, the Canada goose is protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, but it was interesting to see how this kind of moralising was playing out online. But I also realised that something else was going on here in the comments about the killing. The geese really are the most visible of wildlife in this urban area, lacking in rich biodiversity and with minimal green spaces. Those green spaces that are in the ward are either ex-industrial wastelands under threat of development or sites of demolished council housing that have already been earmarked for developing new sellable housing. The geese are so much part of the everyday environment that for some residents, they clearly feel very protective of them, as they would perhaps a pet dog or cat. With other residents, the language is one of empathy and shame about the killing and a sense of trying to exert the rights of the Canada goose to exist as any other local resident. And my thoughts turn to the potential goose killers, much in the same way as Sakak Ibarra's exploration of the whale hunters in the Arctic. I wondered what the relationship was between the goose hunters and the goose hunted as prey. Was there any sense of reverence or responsibility felt by the hunters? How did they perceive their existence and connected or not to this local flock of geese? Is this an annual ritual undertaken and for what purpose? Is there a cultural understanding of other residents' perceptions of their local feathered community? And of course, at this stage, my multi-species ethnography is still in its infancy. But I'm trying to evolve methodology that ensures that the Canada geese are considered as part of my community explorations. They are clearly not separate from their local human species, but I am yet to bottom out the complexity of that relationship, especially between young people and the flock of geese. Importantly, they are also consistent witnesses to the changes and shifting landscape around them. For example, it's not only the local human residents who are negatively impacted by housing development on their few green spaces, but the geese also become displaced as more and more of their space next to the canal is encroached upon. So far, I've not yet heard this latter point taken into consideration by other planners or local residents. So returning to the multi-species framework for heritage studies and practice. The Canada geese in Manchester and the stray dogs in Pristina are just 2 examples where a multi-species framing might open up different stories or perspectives on community, care, resilience, and social belonging within a rapidly changing urban environment. As with Sakak Ibarra's study of the whale in Arctic societies, perhaps less mythical and more trashy animals like the goose and stray dog can act as a yardstick for testing and expressing how the impacts of climate change start to affect how communities function with each other and with other species in need. If heritage is about expressing what we care enough about to save and protect and cherish and remember, then maybe we should be applying an art of attentiveness to the needs and interests of the honking and loitering Canada goose to better connect to and explore that which is negated and deemed dispensable under conditions of raging inequalities in this particular area of Manchester. Heritage has, perhaps for far too long, only focused on promoting the glorious, the beautiful, and that which attains some rarefied status, and as a result, in the gaps fall the stories of people and species that inhabit and love places differently, with less glory, but with pride, creativity, quiet knowledge, and of course, more goose poo. So thank you for listening to my talk. I hope it has provoked some thoughts and also a greater awareness and curiosity for exploring new ways of living together. Thank you.